basically want to just look at the penalty mechanism, want to look at some of the penalty clauses and potential penalty clauses that you can include. We touch on warranties. Warranties is another item within the general condition of contract, and then we'll come back to performance securities. And the way we structured this, if you look at the general condition of contract, the performance security is actually first, but we structured it this way in terms of the logical flow of a contract, right? So we deal with the specification, as Sean was saying, but within the contract, for example, you would first deal with, during the contract term, you'll deal with penalties. Shortly after that, you'll deal with, potential warranties, and then a performance security. That's something that, say, for the duration of that contract or after they've delivered the particular product or service. Let's say it was a generator. You can then say, look, if there's something that goes wrong with the generator within the next 2 years, then we can kick in the performance security, for example, can kick in. So that's why we structured that way. It's more from a time sequence perspective in terms of when those particular clauses could potentially kick in. Now, which is interesting, when we did some research on this, we actually found that in 1962 there's actually a Penalties Act. It was introduced in 1962, and that's still valid. It's still really there, and so quite interesting. The key thing just of that act, and we're not going to go into the detail of that, the key thing is that it says that the penalty must be proportional to the prejudice suffered. And the courts can then impose, if you then insist on a particular penalty and it's not proportional to that, the courts can then reduce that particular penalty. So it was quite interesting to pick that up. Now, as I was saying, let's come back then to the general conditions of contract, and then we'll talk about the general condition of contract, and then in that context, the special condition of contract that all of you, when you put or compile specifications, they need to give consideration to the special condition of contract. So in terms of the general condition of contract, quite extensive, but you can see there that there are a couple of clauses that relates to what we're talking about today. So at the end, we will talk, as I said, about performance security. We'll talk about the warranties, and we'll start off with the penalties. So there's firstly the delay in supply performance, then the penalties, and then an allowance for termination for defaults. We're going to touch briefly on force majeure, and that's really, in terms of the act of God, and because some of these clauses would say subject to clause 25, so subject to a force majeure particular incident. Right. So why do we want to include penalties? A lot of institutions say, look, let's get the war done. Once we're into negotiations, let's then figure out the penalties. And that is problematic for various reasons. Firstly, it's important that the bidder understands the contract requirements upfront when you put out that specification. So it's important that they understand what are the risks. Are they prepared then to take the risks? And, are they going to bid because they're prepared to then accept those risks? And then also to make sure that they cost appropriately for the risks. For example, I've worked in the ICT industry for a while, and quite a while. And there, if you want the system with 99.99% system availability, it's much more expensive than, for example, a system with 99.90% percentage availability. And so a cost is very important in that context. So that's one of the reasons. The other main reason is then from the constitutional section 217 and section 33 of the Constitution, the procedural fairness. We must be fair, we must be transparent, and that is also then important why it needs to be in the specification or not later on. And lastly, and this could be a very strong possibility if you do it too late, the bidder can say to you, look, we didn't agree on this before. I'm not willing to accept it. And so that could then be, or then they would want to reduce that significantly, the penalties that you want to suggest if you do it too late. So that is obviously our reason for suggesting you need to cover it within the specification document. So let's look at the penalty clauses then. So NIGP has got this definition of penalties. We don't have to go and look in detail at that. It's basically, you know, ensuring that the bidder delivers. That's essentially what it comes down to. So there's one of those definitions, and we'll talk a little bit later on about these, you know, the different types of penalties you can have. You know, how do you describe the damages, and they don't have to be monetary terms, but that's interesting that they then obviously pick up the monetary term. So let's then come back to our own South African General Condition of Contract. So there it starts off with the delays, because there's a clause, section 21, that talks about delay in supplies, the delay in supplier performance. So here you can clearly see in section 21.2, it then says, okay, what do we start doing if there's a delay? Okay, it then goes on. So firstly, it then says that the supplier's got a duty to inform the purchaser if there's going to be delay. So that's the first part. It's then up to you as a purchaser to decide what type of penalties, if any, you would want to incur on that particular supplier. Okay. That same clause, subclause of that, then talks about emergency. So it is possible, if you've got an emergency and you want to require a small quantity of a particular product, you can go out and you can go and buy that. So that just, as a purchaser, that allows you to do that. Okay. So the supplier can't submit it in time, and so you can go and get it from another source there. So that just provides you with that particular right. But then comes back to the delay. It then says that you can impose penalties. 21.5 talks about that you can impose penalties if there is a delay in terms of the suppliers not delivering on time. Okay, so that is clearly there. It then goes on further. If you look at on clause 22, it then talks about what that particular penalty could be if you have a delay. Okay, and they talk about using the current prime interest rate. So like a daily rate. So each day that you're late, you work on the prime interest rate. So obviously you will have to divide it by 365 to get the daily rates. Now that is there as a standard condition, as a general condition of contract. Now that particular provision might not be strong enough. Okay, that might not be strong enough to prevent the bidder or to ensure that the bidder then delivers on time. Okay, so for example, on a 6 million contract, we've just done it on a 6 million contract year. If there's a 14-day delay, that gives you, on a 6 million contract, which is quite a bit of money, that's a 24,000 Rand penalty in that particular case. If it was a 600,000 Rand equipment item, that for that 14 days it would only have been 2,000 Rand, 2,400 Rand penalty. Now, if something that you needed, you know, and every day that you're late, you're losing, let's say, 2 million Rand as an example, then 2,000 Rand is not, or 24,000 Rand is not significant. And so that is then one of the things that the BSC must look at. And so in this particular case, is that particular penalty sufficient? Okay, so that was just one of the examples that we wanted to raise. There's obviously also then allowance for the termination of default. So if you're consistently not performing, you know, we can then terminate the contract. Obviously, there are certain clauses that apply, but in essence, the purchaser can then terminate the contract. And so that's made allowance for. Now, what I was talking about earlier is the force majeure thing. So if I'm just jumping back quickly, so if you look at this particular clause here, it says there, subject to clause 25. So obviously, if it's a force majeure incident, then obviously the penalty won't apply, right? And so just important to understand that particular point, and that's why penalties won't apply in the case of force majeure. So what is it that we need to do? I mean, so those general conditions of contract are there, but you can see there's not a lot in terms of penalties. The only thing it says, if it's a late, we can charge you the equivalent of the prime interest rate per day that you're late. And that's not necessarily always punitive enough, if I can put it that way. And so these are then some other examples of standard or special condition of contract clauses that you can introduce into your specification document. You will have the general condition of contract as standard, but you would then introduce special condition of contract clauses. So for example, it could be a delete clause. You can say delete clause 31.1 and 31.2 and replace with the following clause. Okay, and then you would obviously denote it as a special condition of contract clause 31.1. And here's another example. So I don't want to necessarily go through all these examples, but there's where we now want to add something after another clause. Okay, so we want to add after clause 23.7, we want to add clause 23.8, which says these are the other kind of instances that would allow for termination of contract. Because the other circumstances that would allow for termination of contract. And so you can include those type of things in your special condition of contract. You could say that you want to add additional penalty clauses, right? So for example, if it's a cleaning contract or it's a security contract, you would want certain penalty clauses there in terms of certain service items, okay? And so you could then list, for example, as you can see here, you would list the service items, what that service level would be, and what the penalty will be if they don't fulfill that particular service level. And so you can introduce those types of things, you know. So you can say that, you know, for example, if the and you'll see some examples later on, if the security guards are not in their uniforms, then we're gonna, you know, we're gonna incur a penalty on you or something like that. Or you can substitute. We can even substitute clauses. So you can, you know, you can have a substitute clause to say that you substitute 21.1 with this particular clause. And in this particular case, this is actually a real case where that prime interest rate was not big enough. And so they introduced a 0.05% interest rate every day that you're late. Okay, and so in this particular example, they've actually introduced, they didn't use the prime interest rate. They've actually fixed it. And if you look at the example, then there you can see that it's almost now, it's almost double the amount that we saw earlier. Okay, that's the same scenario of the 6 million rand. So that is how you then start using some of these special conditions of contract to introduce stuff that's very specific to you. Just a few notes to mention then in terms of putting together your own penalty clauses. We've spoken about this already. We said it must be proportional. It must be proportional to the prejudice suffered. Remember the Penalties Act. So that is a given. We don't have to talk too much about that. So it must be proportionate. A lot of times, previous company that I worked for, there we used to say that it should hurt the supplier, shouldn't kill them. So a lot of times I see it's extremely excessive. And yeah, so the point is it should hurt them, not kill them, right? So, you know, so for example, a penalty of 50% of the monthly sum, that's kind of, you know, obviously ridiculous. So typically it's 1%, 2%, etc. But obviously you have to look at what damages you will suffer or what the impact is to you, but also then bear that in mind. The other guide I wanted to leave with you is you need to focus on the outputs and not the inputs. So for example, when you typically get a company to do things for you, you know, whether it's outsourcing or whatever, there's an output, there's an outcome that you're looking for. And if they don't achieve the outcome, that is what you want to measure and what you want to penalize if it's not happening, right? So the inputs are really there for them to manage. And so I'll show you later on an example of where they focus on the inputs and not necessarily the outputs. But so that is then another point to mention. And then the other important thing is you need to figure out, don't just put penalties down. You need to figure out who's going to monitor this. How are we going to, and then how easy is it to manage, Is it the supplier that's going to monitor it? Are we going to monitor it? And because there's a practicality to that. So who will monitor the level of service? And how will it be monitored? Now, what type of penalties do we get? There are different types. As I said already, they essentially all come back to monetary at the end of the day, but it don't have to be monetary. So the one that's monetary is then the liquidated, what they typically call liquidated damages. So you'll say we're gonna 2% of your invoice amount, we're gonna deduct your monthly invoice amount. Okay, so that's it might be we're gonna deduct 2,000 Rand per event. Okay, so it's a fixed penalty. So those are monetary. Okay, what you actually do also have is what they call service credit. So in an ICT environment, for example, when you do maintenance or you do support, right? If you don't achieve your objectives in terms of your service levels, you'll say, okay, we're actually going to give you if we haven't achieved it, we're going to give you an extra 2 hours of support for free. That's a service credit. That's an example of a service. So it's not monetary, but we would then exchange time in that particular case. So that's a service credit. And then you can get license extensions. So you have a Microsoft or a Oracle or whatever license, and if they don't perform according to the service level, then the license expires for another period of time. So for another month or 2 months, etc., etc. So those are all then other types of penalties or sanctions. And then the last one here is this is most probably on the one side very extreme, and on the other side not so extreme. We can say, we will not write a reference letter for you if you're not performing. So it don't have to be these things that we've listed up front. It can be, if you haven't performed, we're not going to write the reference letters for you. So which is, as I said, that's very mild, if you like, a type of penalty. But on the extreme side, we can say, look, if you don't perform, and obviously now after the second or the fifth, whatever time, then we're going to actually ask that you be restricted from doing business with the state. And so that is another form of penalty that can be incurred. So I was talking earlier about the service credits, and here the UN is an example, the UN in Jordan, where they wanted a company to provide them with internet connectivity. This is then the example where they use service credits. Okay, so that would be an example of that. And this is then SAQA, the South African Qualification Authority. So this is on the website, this is on the internet, so it's generally available. And so there, for example, where they would have used different types of service items, and then what the target or the service level would be, and what the penalty will be. Okay. So, for example, if the guards didn't have the uniforms on, etc., then these are the 2% penalty for each incident. Now, you could argue that that might be a bit extreme, because if it's going to be like 2% of the monthly fee, or maybe it should have been 1%, but the point is, you can then look at that stuff. So maybe after so many incidents, then you stop. Okay, so up to 1% of monthly fees, up to 5 incidents, or whatever the case is. So yeah, just wanted to show you that there are other examples of penalties that's out there. Right, so we don't have to go too much into detail, but you can see, so they've standard use the 2% penalty. Right, so that's penalties. Okay. Now get back to the warranties. The warranties is another thing. So warranties now, typically these would be used. There's a product. We expect the product to work according to, the requirements. If it becomes faulty, etc., the warranty kicks in, because now the supplier must come either and replace that particular product or fix it. Okay, and that's where the warranties comes in. So again, we've got some sources here in terms of what the warranty is. We don't have to go through that now today too much in detail. I've given you the reference sources here, so you can have a look at that. But again, in terms of our own general condition of contract, there's a warranty clause there. The warranty then talks about there must be the supplier warranty. You can see there are a few clauses related to that. Now, typically, not typically, I mean, there's 12 months. So the GCC makes allowance for a 12-month warranty period. Okay, and that's standard, 12 months warranty period. But a lot of times you actually want, as a purchaser, as an institution, you want a longer warranty period. We're working with a client where they, for example, where it is service, hardware service in the field, and they want the warranty for that, and also in that industry it's normal. So the warranty on those type of products should be 3 years. Now, in that particular case, you have to then write a special condition of contract, because this only allows for 12 months. So you then have to put a special condition contract. The warranty is for 3 years, or the warranty must be for 5 years. Okay. And so you need to include those things, bearing this in mind. So just another thing that we wanted to point out to you. The other thing around warranties, what needs to happen? So it says that you must refix. Okay. So it says you must come and repair. But within which period, for example? Okay, and again, it's not clear. It's open in the general condition of contract. They then say specifically refer you to the SEC. So you'll then say, look, if we notify you, you need to be able to fix it within 3 days or within 5, whatever the days are. Okay, that again needs to come into your special condition of contract. And this is an example, then another example from Fosco, where they brought in a special condition of contract clause around warranties. This is an example from the UN, where they actually, what they did with the warranties, they actually said for warranties, what we do is we're gonna retain 4%. So of that invoice amount, we're gonna retain 4% for the duration of the contract. Sorry, not for the duration of the contract, but for the duration of that warranty period. And after the warranty period, we will then pay you the 4%. So that is just an example of what they do. I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm saying that is an example of it, of what you. So those are some of the warranty type of special condition of contract clauses that you could consider. So lastly now, so we talked about penalties. We spoke about warranties, and now let's just talk briefly on performance securities. Now, as I said, performance securities is again ensuring that the supplier performs, but this is kind of more longer term, right? So as the example I mentioned earlier, it's typically around services. So we've given you a generator, and the generator now, and you need to now, this generator need to work for the next 2 years, and so we're going to keep this performance security for the 2-year period. Okay. So again, relates back to the general condition of contract clause first in terms of performance securities. You can see again, the general condition refers to performance securities, but there's no detail in terms of performance securities. They then again said you must go and look at the special condition of contract. Okay, like a lot of clauses in the general condition of contract. And so, yeah, performance securities must be described. If you want to include it, you must describe it then in your special condition of contract. So you can make use of financial industry instruments like a bank guarantee, or sometimes a letter of credit. There are different types of performance securities. Okay, the one is what you would call a guarantee, and we'll talk about those different we'll go through some of those different products now. So yeah, some of the different types of performance securities you can have. You can either have a performance guarantee in the form of the surety bond, or in the form of demand guarantee. Surety bond typically issued by insurance companies, and the demand guarantee is typically issued by bank guarantee, typically issued by banks. Okay. There could also be a big company, and the parent company could then give a parent company guarantee to the subsidiary, right? So that could be another type of guarantee. So those are then different types of guarantees. But there's also another form of performance securities which relates to retentions money, and this is typically used well, not typically, it is used in the CIDB, in the construction environment. And so you'll say there's a retention amount of between 5 and 12.5%. So after a particular phase is done, we will after a particular phase is done, and you're going to bill us, we're going to retain 5 or 12%, whatever that is, of the money. And if there are any defaults or mistakes, then you will fix, and afterwards we will pay that 5%, 12%. So that is also, that a retention is also another form of performance security. And then the other one, not used, this is not used extensively, but where there's an advance payment. So, you know, cash flow issues. So the institution might give an advance payment to the prime contractor to pay, for example, the subcontractors, etc. But then for that, because it's a risk, that particular institution, or not this institution, but the supplier must then give an advance payment guarantee to the institution to manage that risk. So that's just another form of performance security. And here's I mentioned earlier the CIDB, and so this is an example where the CIDB then make use of performance guarantees and securities here, retentions at the bottom. Right, the UN's got another example, so we just extracted an example from the UN again to do with those performance securities. This is an example from Northwest Provincial Treasury, Northwest Province. I think Advocate Alan Fenton might have put this together. So there's some other particular, kind of guarantees that they would have used, as you could see here. Okay. Now, when you consider these performance guarantees, what are the things that you need to look at? You obviously, the most important one is that you want to look at the impact to you as an institution. Okay, what's the impact on me from a risk perspective if the supply don't perform? So that's one of the considerations. The likely cost if you need to go and find another supplier to come and do the thing. Okay, what is that cost associated with that? So that needs to go into there. By the way, I had 2 slides earlier which I kind of skipped over. One of the things is if these particular products or services are readily available, it's like then you most probably won't have a performance guarantee. Okay, so yeah, the likely cost would be considered in terms of this getting a performance security in place. Whether you can get the goods or services, just what I mentioned earlier now, you can get the goods or services from another particular place quite easily. And also then you want to look at the experience of the tenderers and what are the types of risk in that particular industry. And so that's another thing. And then also then the complexity, it also comes back to risk, the magnitude and the complexity of the contract. And so those things you would factor in terms of determining appropriate performance security. I think Sean, that's it from my side.